Brother Nate, you're back.
I'm back. Yeah. You didn't scare me off.
No, not at all. Well, I guess we should do some introduction for those who are watching for the first time, who perhaps didn't catch the first time you were on the Great Conversations show. And so, number one, you're my pastor.
I am, yes.
Not just a pastor here in Ingersoll in Ontario, Canada, but you decided, or were led to preach through the book of Genesis a short while ago. Well, it's not really a short while ago.
No,
when did you start?
We started it in September,
Right.
so we're in month 5 of of the series, and we're more than halfway through the first 11 chapters, so that's good. But God really kind of led me to preach through Genesis. Obviously, there's been a lot of cultural upheaval in the last couple of years, and our church, by the grace of God, has been growing, and there's a lot of people coming in from different churches and different denominations. And so part of it was we kind of wanted to plant our flag in terms of where we stand in Genesis.
Right.
But certainly it was also, as you know, and as we've talked about many times, all of the cultural issues that we're facing today are solved by the Word of God, and it all starts in Genesis. Right. And the foundation that's laid in Genesis, if we stand firm on that foundation, we actually don't get tossed to and fro from every wind that's coming at us from the cultural upheaval. And so that was really it. It was practical because we wanted to let people know where we stood, young earth creationists.
Right.
And then on top of that, it was also very relevant because all of these issues, every sermon, I've been shocked just how much just very relevant personal application there is in Genesis as we're building the foundation that God laid at the beginning.
Yeah, I remember very early on hearing Ken in one of his presentations just saying, all Christian doctrines directly or indirectly are founded in the book of Genesis.
Yep.
And it stood out to me. And over the years, I've, in a sense, tested it, but it's true.
Yeah.
I remember hearing one time somebody challenged him saying, well, what about, soteriology? What about this? And he said something like, yeah, well, if it wasn't for Genesis 3, you wouldn't even be talking about it. I can't do a very good Australian accent, but anyway.
That was good.
I'm more British, do a better British accent than Australian. But yeah, so it's just so true. So have you found that, digging through it, this is the first time you've gone through an expository?
Yeah. So obviously I've studied the book of Genesis many times, but this is the first time that I've preached expositionally, verse by verse, chapter by chapter through it. And so obviously you dig out a lot more. I'm learning a ton.
Yep.
I'm teaching a ton of stuff that people are saying they haven't heard before. And that's not anything other than when you dig in, you really realize how much is there.
Right.
And I mean, you joke about soteriology and stuff. I had somebody who said to me, this is somebody who goes to a different church, and kind of said like, wow, with the growth at your church, you think that you'd really want to just focus on the gospel. And they didn't say that in a condescending sort of way. They were just sort of like, wouldn't you be better served in a New Testament epistle that's expositing the doctrines of grace or something? And I just said it's all there in Genesis, man. Like we're going to be talking predominantly about Noah's flood today, and look at this, the world is saved through the righteousness of one man. God, that'll preach,
Yep.
And so the gospel is clear there. Genesis 3:15, all of the archetypes, all of the foreshadowing of the Messiah. There's so much there, and I feel like we could spend. Well, I think you jokingly said, "Well, I just kind of parked my ministry there. I've been there for 25 years, so
exactly.
I don't think I'll preach through it quite that long, but I'm certainly enjoying our time there."
Yeah. Well, I've got to admit too, my wife and I both. I mean, obviously, I have parked in Genesis for a long time, but you're digging some things out there that I hadn't really considered before. So I'm really enjoying the series too. With my small groups, I've often just said, "Hey, can we not talk about Genesis?" It's kind of what I do. But no, I've really been enjoying your sermon, so getting a lot out of it. So, of course, once you went through the flood narrative, the history that's there in Genesis 6-9, you quickly found that there are so many questions that erupt from just going through it as plainly written. Correct?
Absolutely. And that's so obviously you and I, there's a lot of similarities between what you do and what I do. But one of the differences as you go and do a seminar, you're teaching people apologetically how to defend the faith. You're talking to them about the history here. I'm preaching a sermon.
Right.
And so sometimes there are details there that you can't get to. You can't answer every scientific question that arises.
Right.
But man, they're there. And I think this coming Sunday will be my 4th or 5th Sunday in the flood narrative, just
Right.
Genesis 6 to 9. And even in that, there have been just geological discoveries and scientific discoveries and questions that have come up that I haven't been able to get to. So I kind of said, hey, let's do a Q&A. We got Cal in our church. Why not take advantage of it?
Yeah.
And so I said, why don't you and I get together and do a Q&A with some of the questions that I haven't been gotten a chance to get to. And man, the congregation responded. There were tons of questions that came in, and I think we got some good ones to go through today.
Absolutely, yeah. I was very pleased to see the questions. Now, to be honest, they're the same questions that I would have gotten asked, over the last 20 years. And interestingly, for people to know, they're the same questions I get, whether it's from a Bible skeptic or whether it's a Christian in the church, because the skeptics have done a really good job in trying to undermine this account, because they understand if you take out the foundation, the entire structure falls. And so the flood narrative is one of the most well-known Bible stories. It's history, but to the world, it's often just a story, and it's one of the most attacked.
Absolutely.
Right? So last year, actually, our feature video series, because we couldn't get out speaking at churches very much here in Canada, was called The Genesis Account of Noah's Ark.
Yep.
And so would encourage people to check that out. It's a 10-part series. All of the questions we're going to cover today are in there somewhere, but we'll answer this more succinctly. But people can check that out. And just to be honest, I think what I do as a speaker is probably way easier than what you do, brother. Because as a pastor, I get the opportunity to take one area of scripture and just really, that's what Answers in Genesis does. You've got a group of very brilliant experts taking one aspect of the biblical account and just, sharpening those tools really well. Monday comes, you're back in prayer, you're looking at the word, you've got to prepare a sermon for next week. Over the years, people have come up and said, wow, that was a really good talk, Cal. And I'm like, well, it should be. I've given the same talk 50 times this year. But anyway.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting you say that, though, because as you said that these are the same questions whether you're talking to a skeptic or a Christian.
Right.
And I think just what we should highlight on the onset, the reason the answers to these questions are so important is because as a Christian, if you can't answer them,
right,
the skeptics can.
Yep.
And so when your kids, right, start questioning things and they come to that age where they're struggling to make their faith their own, there are answers to these questions from our opponents.
Right.
And so we ought to have answers, as those who believe the Bible, to be able to say, no, it's history, and this is how we can see that. So there are answers to these questions, and there's answers from both sides,
right,
which means that we need to be sure of what we believe.
Exactly. And the other thing I like to point out to people, because sometimes when apologetic questions come up, I've often had Christians just say, well, God just did it.
Yep.
God just supernaturally did it. Well, yeah, God does a lot of supernatural things in Scripture. But when you think about it, the miracles that happen, like a donkey talking, for example, like that's a big deal. Okay. Yep. Donkeys don't talk. Well, except for Shrek. But anyway, so when something like that happens in the scripture, like that is a miracle. It's supernatural. That's why we call it a miracle. And so when we're defending the scripture, we want to defend the text, what's in there.
Yeah.
Here's how many animals came on board. Well, then what does that produce as far as waste management go and all these things? We want to defend the actual narrative, not just kind of hand wave and say, well, God just took care of everything. It's like, that's not the way God's operating here. There are some supernatural things. For example, the animals were sent to Noah, right?
Yep.
Some people think, oh, well, he was running around like a zookeeper and doing all this stuff. No, well, that's a supernatural effect. But of course, we see that even reflected in things like migration. Right? So that's something that you can see how God can, genetically use things like that to draw them to certain areas. And anyway, we want to defend it as real history, not just hand wave.
Well, and sometimes that answer, well, that's just the way God did it. that answer might be right? The bigger our view of God, the more we understand He can do whatever He wants.
Exactly.
But that's sort of like giving your kids the answer to every question because I say so. That's ultimately, that is the right answer.
Yep.
They're called to obey their parents, but you're not teaching them critical thinking if that's your answer to everything. you need to give them the why. You need to help them understand. And so similarly, as Christians, we ought to give people more information than just that's because God said. Now, that is ultimately the right answer, but there are answers that are better for the discipleship of a believer.
Correct. It's like people saying, well, apologetics is no big deal because, however you parse someone, either not coming to Christ or losing their faith, quote unquote, or et cetera, it's just a sin. So it's just because of sin. And it's like, yeah, but that's like saying there was a plane crash and the reason it fell is because of gravity.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, yeah, it's a good point. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. It fell out of the sky because of gravity. But
maybe we should examine the plane.
Yeah, and check out that black box. So anyway, we're going to get into the questions here that were given. And last night, actually, during one of the small group sessions there, I had another question. So we'll insert that as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
Because it was someone from our congregation. So I'll just get you to read the questions, and then we'll start doing this.
Sure.
And if it goes long, we might break this up into two parts.
I'll just start one at a time rather than having a long time where I'm reading questions that we won't get to for a while, because we can both be long-winded, Cal. I'm told.
What?
So I've kind of categorized these, and so there's a couple questions based on kinds. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's the first question: when Nate said that there was just one dog kind, and that it contained all the genetic material for all the current dog species, how do we know the word translated for kind is the same as the word used by scientists, right? So we know that there's this, we break down the animal kingdom and everything into philo and kingdom and species. So I made a big deal of the fact that only one of every kind of animal needed to come onto the ark in order to preserve the genetic material for whether it's a wolf or a chihuahua.
It's a very common question we get. Yeah.
So I'm going to tee these up for you, Cal, so you can go, and if I want to add anything, I'll...
And there was another question that kind of was similar, right?
Yeah, why don't I read that one
You
too?
read that one as well, and then we'll go through it. Yeah.
Good call, yeah. So the second question is, when the Bible says that there was male and female, two of every kind, does that mean that there was a male and female dog, just simply one species of a dog, or was there every kind of species of dog with male and female? I don't want to be an evolutionist. Well, that's good. But how were the other species made if it was just one female dog and one male dog?
Right. So you can see here, even in the way the question is phrased, I don't want to be an evolutionist, but I mean, how are these other species made, et cetera, right? So you can see the confusion that the skeptics have put out there. So the first thing we want to figure out is the word kind, because you've already seen it compared to the Linnaean classification system that we commonly use, or that's kind of the root of where our classification system came from, et cetera. And you can see the confusion between, well, do you need, a Pomeranian and a Great Pyrenees and Pekingese and all this
Surely
kind of stuff.
You need a Great Dane and a Chihuahua.
So I actually put some notes together, things that I use in presentations and obviously from articles we've got on the website. So I'm going to read this quote and then we can dig into that. So this is from Science Magazine, very prestigious evolutionary based magazine. And it's talking about the origin of domestic dogs. And it'll give us some clues as we dig into this. And it said the origin of the domestic dog from wolves has been established. We examined the mitochondrial DNA sequence variation among 654 domestic dogs, representing all major dog populations worldwide, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. So here's an evolutionary, source admitting all of the dog kinds that we see today all came from wolves, which gives you the indication that wolves were probably closer to the original dog kind that God created. So, we use dogs a lot in our presentations because a lot of, Western folks like dogs and have them and stuff. And so we can see this incredible variation among the dog kind. Well, a lot of those dog breeds we have, quote unquote, created in the last 200-300 years.
Right.
Simply by looking for genetic traits that we think are, cool, like, wow, that's really quirky. And so you find a couple of those dogs that have similar traits and you breed them together and you focus those genetics. And you can come up with some pretty cool looking dogs. You also come up with some problems.
Totally.
Because you're we call them purebreds, but you should call them inbreds. That's what they are. And so Anyway, if you understand that the word used in Genesis for kind is min, it's the Hebrew word min, it's not the same, it's not equivalent to what we call species, okay? So I got another quote here from the Encyclopedia of Environmental Management talking about species concepts.
Yep.
And it's going to talk about the origin of the Linnaean system and Darwinian evolution, how that changed and everything. It's a bit of a longer quote, but again, I think it'll help us answer the questions here. So it says the concepts or ideas that underlie what biologists mean by the term species. As it says, evolution produces diversity at many levels. There are evolutionists, of course, from genes, races, species to genera and higher taxa. There are many problems in classifying this diversity, especially with regard to the level in the evolutionary hierarchy in which to place a particular taxon. The species has often been held in special regard as the only real taxon. However, there is an extraordinary number of different concepts, ideas, and definitions of organic species. Only a few can be summarized here. I just wanted to point this out because, sometimes you're in high school science class and they say, here's the classification system. And somehow your brain goes, oh, so that relates directly to the real world and how we see things. It's a man-made system.
Right.
We're trying to understand God's world, and we've come up with names to try to, categorize and all that
simplify.
stuff. Yeah. So it goes on and it says, the ancient philosophical term genus and species were used in logic to classify objects and ideas as well as living organisms. Okay. The species was a collection of objects that had a common underlying essence. In fact, the Greek term for species and essence were the same. The genus was a group of such species with its own broader essence. For biological organisms, the essentialism fitted well with the biblical story of creation. Here's an evolution. They're going back and saying, and Linnaeus, who was a Christian, adopted this essentialist view of classification in his ambitious project to catalog every organism known at the time in the 18th century. He pioneered the use of binomial nomenclature, Latin scientific names, which serve as shorthand for descriptions of species. And then the rise of evolutionary ideas meant that the old creationist essentialism was no longer tenable. See, because if you've got this idea that everything's constantly morphing from one thing to another, how then do you just say, well, at this point in time, here's the classification of this thing? Because isn't it
morphing? Isn't it changing? Isn't it in
maybe
flux?
It's not right now. Maybe it's stopped evolving, but perhaps it's going to continue, etc. So anyway, just so you know, the Linnaean classification system, we've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The fact is, when the Bible says kinds of creatures to reproduce according to their kinds, we would say, well, dogs make dog kinds and horses make horse kinds. But understanding what all of the animals that exist in a certain kind, we don't know yet, because primarily the word species today is defined. There's lots of ways to define it, as the article said, but it's a group of organisms that breed basically amongst themselves.
Right.
The problem with that is you've got all these different species of, let's say, fruit flies. And so this species of fruit fly won't breed with this one. And this one won't breed with this one. But this one will breed with this one. So is it the same kind, right? All you've got is it's the same kind of creature. It's a fruit fly. But certain ones won't breed with others.
And you can see this. You can Google like a liger, for example, where they breed a tiger and a lion together.
Right.
And depending on whether or not one is female and one is male, they might be fertile or infertile. And
Exactly.
same with breeding horses with donkeys and,
Yep.
and creating mules and stuff like that. And so it's not as black and white as kind of saying this is the cutoff for fertility.
That's right.
But what is interesting is that it does talk, like this does once again affirm Scripture.
Yep.
Because when God created all their kinds, he tells them to be fruitful and multiply according to their kinds. And that multiplication within God's parameters, the blessing of God for things doing what they're created to do is multiplication.
Absolutely.
So,
and it's really an important thing for creationists to understand, or Christians to understand, that biblical creationists, we believe in rapid speciation. We've actually been accused of our brethren, our Christians, who have adopted old earth ideas and stuff like that, day age theory and stuff like that. They've accused us of hyper evolution. Because see, when you consider the number of kinds of creatures that needed to be on Noah's Ark,
Yep.
and you look at the number of species today, one of the biggest objections you'll hear skeptics say is, okay, if you're going to believe this guy built this boat, this floating zoo, there are millions of species of animals on the planet today, and there's no way you could have put that many onto the Ark, right? So we're like, we understand that. Now, interestingly, there have been many cases of rapid speciation studied within our lifetime. And so that confirms what we've always believed.
Right.
But it's the same thing as the dog examples I gave. You start off with, something like a wolf, and now you've got something like a Chihuahua. That's not evolution.
Yeah.
That's it could be speciation, it's natural selection, but it's not evolution, because that dog kind doesn't have new forms, functions, and features that aren't within the dog kind. They don't have wings or...
And I think an easy way for us to understand this sort of in layman's terms is just think about when parents come together and start having kids, right? So you can start to see how, we say it all the time, he looks so much like his father, she looks so much like her father or like her mother or whatever. And you see that those kids have kids who can look rapidly different from their grandparents, right? And of course, there are some genetic traces, but you can see that just a few generations, you can all of a sudden have a very, very tall family when the grandparents are I always kind of jokingly talked about, because my dad's very short and me and my brother are very tall.
Right.
And so you'd always get the sort of, where'd you come from kind of thing. And my dad always hated when I said, well, the milkman was tall, and he didn't like those jokes. But but the whole point here is that you can have that sort of radicalization very, very quickly. And I think, one of the things that as you're talking, it makes me think of is I remember when I was in school and you study Darwin's finches, right? So, Darwin goes out and he notices all these different finches with different beaks based on what they ate on the island. And I remember early on thinking, well, I don't believe in evolution, so what do I think about this?
Right.
Well, I think it's helpful for some Christians to know. Maybe just saying it plainly is, we believe in
natural selection.
Natural selection. We believe that within a species, based on environment and where they're breeding, how they're breeding, what they're breeding with, will change the species, or will change the function of the organism, but it won't change it fundamentally.
It doesn't change from one kind into another kind. So I'll often use the idea of evolutionists always saying dinosaurs evolved into birds. So you've got a lizard-like creature turning into a bird-like creature. Right. Well, there are fundamental differences, right? Differences in lung types. Like we're talking a type. You've got hollow bones versus solid bones. You've got feathers over here. You don't have feathers over here, even though they like to say dinosaurs had feathers now. But preening glands.
We got to remake Jurassic Park.
All that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I wrote down a couple of notes here because this is one of the biggest, skeptics' attacks. You couldn't have had that many millions of species anyway. So I looked up a study, and in 2014, actually, it was stated that there's 1.8 million documented species on Earth in 2014. But 98% of those were fish, invertebrates, and plants.
Interesting.
So the study said that there was 34,000 land-dependent species. Okay, 34,000. So you go from millions of many. It's elephant hurling, is right the term in logic. You go from millions down to 34,000. Well, that's still a lot, right?
It is.
Land-dependent species. But then when we start to think of all the different dog kinds that we have today, all just being one kind, you quickly see how the numbers are shrinking here. And this claim that the skeptics give about Noah's Ark not being, feasible is not tenable. So when you go to the Ark Encounter, right, the life-size Noah's Ark that Answers in Genesis US built, they always used the worst-case scenario when trying to figure out how many animals needed to be on board. So, for example, because we haven't done breeding experiments with all of the different animals we see, one of them, the bat kind, for example, because they hadn't done all different breeding experiments, they actually listed them as separately created kinds of bats, which is unlikely, right? God probably created one kind of bat kind, and you get all the variation we see. Regardless, because they hadn't done the experiments, they said, no problem. We want to give the skeptics the benefit of the doubt. Worst case scenario and everything. And so really, when you parse it all out, and I go through this in that Genesis account of Noah's Ark series, you've got 7,000 animals on board the Ark. You've got 1,400 kinds, and about 7,000 animals. And the reason why the disparities there, well, you got 2 of every 7 of some creature.
Yep.
Or 7 pairs, depending on how that reads. And because we haven't done the breeding experiments, we just did the worst case. So you've got 7,000 animals on board Noah's Ark. They're a very specific kind. They breathe air through their nostrils. That excludes things like insects, which take air in through spiracles and stuff like that through their body. So yeah, there are great answers to the questions that the skeptics have posed. And what I'll do is I'll actually link down below when we post this some great resources that people can take a look at, because we've got a great book called How Many Kinds Were on the Ark, and it answers these questions very well.
And so just really quickly so that we can kind of give, so let's then talk, so we can boil it down to about 7,000 different kinds that are on the Ark. Let's talk really quickly about how you get from a wolf to a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. Just really kind of quickly, so that people can understand, because I think a lot of people who have no idea about animal husbandry and just sort of breeding and genetics would kind of go, how are these two things, we have a couple people in our church, Corey McKenna, who's a little bit smaller, and this other guy, Jan, and Corey made the joke the other day. He's like, can you believe we're the same species? Because they look like, like a hobbit and a troll or something when they're next to one another. And that's not, I love them both.
Boy, you're going to take some flack, Pastor.
Seriously, I am.
That's not very shepherdly.
But it's quite funny because we look at, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, and you think, okay, like that's, how do they both come from a wolf?
Right.
So really, really quickly, I guess you could probably explain this a whole lot better than I can, but just explain how breeding would diversify and sort of point out specific characteristics.
Right. So obviously, sexually reproducing organisms, you get half your DNA from mom, half your DNA from dad. And so you've got basically, think of it as 2 slots at the same location. And for the different genes that might code for the color of your eyes or how tall you're going to be, length of fur or hair on a creature or something like that.
All these little information points.
Right.
And you're getting half from each side, right?
Right. And you can inherit, they could be similar bits of information. So let's say you've got a gene that codes for long hair on a dog and another gene that codes for long hair on a dog. Guess what? That dog is going to produce. It's going to have long hair.
Right.
Or you could have one that's, let's say, a gene for short hair and then a gene for long hair. And depending on what gets expressed, that's why you can get variation within creatures, because the genetic information is not the same. Some people are tall, some people are shorter. We've got extremes. You go from Robert Wadlow on one end of the scale, I don't know, he was almost 8.5 feet tall or something, the tallest man we've got on film. And then you've got... I can't remember her name. I've got her in one of my presentations. Anyway, fully grown, she was about this tall, just over 2 feet. And she looked proportionally very normal. Just she could literally stand on this table and be this tall. So you see the variations, right. And then the genetics for either long or tall or short or, all these kind of things. So depending on what the offspring inherit from their mom or dad, you're going to be able to have this variation. So for example, you're talking about dogs. Well, if you want a tall dog, let's say you start with a certain, gene pool of dogs, and you see the bigger ones, take the bigger ones, breed them together. There's more likelihood that their offspring are going to have the genes for largeness, so to speak.
That's right.
And you keep doing that and keep focusing genes for largeness or smallness. And you end up with teacup poodles. But the fact is the genetic information was already there.
That's right.
You see, what evolution requires by definition is for genetic information for new forms, functions, and features that never before existed.
Right.
So if you believe in the story of evolution, at one time there was no genetic information to create wings, right? So the creatures didn't have wings. Where did that genetic information come from?
Right.
But all we see in gene pools and creatures we've studied is, okay, you can divvy up the gene pool and stuff like that. And I often use an example of a deck of cards. You get 2 decks of cards. Here's mom, here's dad. You deal half and half. The new deck might be quite different from these 2, depending on what got inherited. So you see variation, you see change in living things, but you will never see one kind of creature, a horse kind turn into a bear kind,
right,
et cetera. So
and so really, I always kind of jokingly say that everybody believes in a virgin birth. Right, so Christians believe in the virgin birth of Christ, and evolutionists believe in the virgin birth of the cosmos, and so there's this idea that whether it's genetic material springing up, whether it's the Big Bang springing up, whether it's whatever, evolutionists actually have to believe in far more spontaneous acts of non-life to life, right? Than
that's
we
a
do.
huge barrier.
Which is a huge barrier, absolutely. So and what you see is, and you can just logically work through this. So you have a wolf, and it breeds, and some of the larger wolves start breeding together, and you're starting to get disparity. And as they roam out, you would notice that maybe a pack of larger wolves would be eating bigger food and growing larger and continuing to, and you'd have the animals over here that are breeding together start despairing, and at some point they actually disperse. They don't go in their packs or whatever, just because of the variations that they're starting to see. And then you can see how over time, you get different
specificity.
Exactly. And based on their diet, based on environment, based on all those kinds of things. And so that's what we believe as creationists. We believe in the variations, but what we don't believe is that one thing fundamentally becomes another, because again, that's to believe that there is this act of spontaneous, miraculous creation whenever a new feature, like a wing or like a third eye or like a horn, all of a sudden comes in.
And not to misrepresent evolutionists, because they would say, well, it doesn't just suddenly spring into being. They would say it happens slowly, and you get micro changes that add up to big changes and all that kind of stuff. I don't want to mislead what an evolutionist would say, but fundamentally that's true. At one point in time, there was no lungs.
Right.
Where do lungs come from, or eyes, or whatever?
Right.
And they would say, well, you started with something simple and it became more complex. And we understand that, but overall, evolutionists must have a mechanism that is creative, that can somehow create new genetic information for new forms, functions, and features. And we have never seen that occur.
That's right.
So the typical example we would use in a presentation to get people to understand that natural selection is a real, we believe in that. It's fundamental to our belief in the speciation, the kinds having all sorts of variations, is the dog kind. And in a presentation, I'll say, okay, you got two slots of information. You got one, here's mom dog. She's got a gene for long hair and a gene for short hair. And here's dad, gene for long hair and short hair. And they reproduce. Well, depending on what the offspring, it gets the long hair from dad, long hair from mom, it's got long hair. Some of them have medium length fur like mom and dad. Some have short hair. If they, let's say, moved from where we are now here in Southern Ontario up north to where I was born in North Bay, okay, Ontario. And let's say it's late fall, but it's still warm. But all of a sudden, so you've got a group of dogs, some have short, some have medium, and some have long fur. And all of a sudden, a terrible ice storm hit. Well, the short-haired dogs are probably going to perish.
Right.
The medium length fur dogs are going to get out of the area as soon as they can, go down south. But the longer-haired dogs might go, well, they can survive the environment.
And there's more food for them now because everyone else just moved out. So why would they move?
With the other creatures that are there. But then those long-haired dogs are going to interbreed with the same dogs that have genetics for long hair. And so eventually you're going to get a population with only long hair within that environment. And the evolutionists would say, look, they've adapted, they've evolved to their environment. And as creationists would say, well, yeah, but the genetic information for long hair pre-existed them moving to that. It's That's just right. that the game, survival, the rule set up here for cold doesn't favor short-haired dogs.
Right.
Now you take these dogs and you pop them in the Sahara Desert,
they're not surviving.
They don't do well. So understand that natural selection is real. We can observe it. We think it's an integral part of the creation model because of the dispersion after the flood, but it's not evolution.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. And I would just say for anybody, as we were talking about wings and that sort of stuff, one kind of term that you should familiarize yourself with is the term irreducibly complex, right? Or irreducible complexity. And within the creation model of how we understand the world, we would just say that there are certain things that are irreducibly complex, right? So the evolutionist would say that this new genetic material adapts slowly over time with small gradual changes. And we would say if we can look at the world and look at the functions and the various features within species, and we can come up with something that's irreducibly complex. And I know the analogy for this is often a mousetrap. You think of a mousetrap; it only has a few parts. It has that sort of wood piece. It's got the base. It's got the guillotine.
Yeah,
it's got the spring. It's got the little cheese tray, and it's got a staple, right? And if you take any one of those things out, the mousetrap doesn't work.
Correct.
And so that's the idea of irreducibly complex. And so when you look at features that are irreducibly complex and you say that the genetic markers for this wing couldn't be used in something else, you very quickly understand that why a species cannot evolve into a completely different species because of that. So
it's
just something for them to look up.
Very interconnected group of things that need to be at the same time in order for a creature to function. Yeah,
that's right.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're going to jump into some questions about animals. And so the first question is, I've learned so much in this series I never knew, like the continents all being one. So we will talk about that a little bit. Are there details about animals that may be helpful for me to picture where they're adults? Were they adults? And I think that last phrase is actually something really neat. I don't know if you want me to go through a bunch of these questions and you want to summarize them.
Yeah, let's go through them one by one here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that I think that question is interesting because I do think when you think of elephants or the elephant kind or the giraffe kind, maybe giraffes. Anyway, you know more about the classification, but these did not have to be full adults. These did not have to be adult species. And probably, in his wisdom, God would have figured out a way to bring a whole lot of younger elephants or whatever so that the size of the animals weren't full. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, obviously, the older certain creatures get, the bigger they get, right? You look at an elephant, for example, and, a fully grown bull elephant, let's say 12 tons, that's pretty big. It's a pretty massive creature. Tyrannosaur might have been 18 tons, something like that, fully grown. So, yeah, I mean, the whole point of the animals that God sent to Noah, he didn't collect them, was that they would be fruitful and multiply and reproduce. So you're not going to bring grandma and grandpa elephant on board the ark. You're not going to bring grandma and grandpa dinosaur on board the ark because you want the teenagers, so to speak, the young, fertile creatures, the perfect ones that God sent to Noah in God's wisdom, whatever they were. And so, yeah, we can understand that they needed to be of adult age, as in when they disembarked, they could start reproducing because that was the whole purpose.
Yep.
But yeah, you didn't need fully grown
creatures. And that kind of plays into the next question, which is, were there dinosaurs on the ark? And if so, how many kinds of dinosaurs are there? Which I thought was interesting. So that kind of plays together because you're thinking about some of the biggest creatures that were on the ark, because you and I would both agree that there were dinosaurs on the ark.
Absolutely.
So what's the question here is, how many kinds of dinosaurs are there?
Right.
Because again, so you've talked about 7,000, but 7,000 bats are a little different than 7,000 dinosaurs. So helping people to understand that this can, that the ark could sustain the life within it. How many dinosaur kinds are there? Yeah.
So again, just to go over what we would say, there would be 1,400 kinds of creatures on the ark, 7,000 animals on board.
Yes.
Okay. So dinosaurs, we tend to think of them as this totally separate group of creatures, because that's how the evolutionists have portrayed it. I've done a feature video called "Was There Really a Land Before Time?" And in there, I actually demonstrate what has been found alongside dinosaur bones, because most people don't picture this.
Absolutely.
They picture dinosaurs. There's a volcano going off in the background. The plants are very exotic. If there's any kind of mammalian creature, it's some little shrew-like creature, and everything's very, very reptilian. And yet they've found beavers in the same layers with dinosaurs. They've found platypus in the same layers with dinosaurs. They've found badgers in the same layers as dinosaurs. We'll get into the human thing in a bit. It's one of the main questions. So they've found all sorts of these creatures buried together. But when's the last time, ducks, for example, they've found buried alongside dinosaurs?
You don't see that in the Land Before Time cartoons.
You don't. That's what I'll say jokingly in my dinosaur presentation. Like, when's the last time you saw a picture of dinosaurs and there's a beaver building his dam and a tyrannosaur there and a brontosaurus and then the ducks, quack, 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 going by.
Some Canadian geese flying overhead.
Exactly. Because they've tried to make that Land Before Time thing, that they lived millions of years ago and all this kind of stuff. So when you think about the dogs, so I just get people, Google dog species or breeds, and you see all the variations. Well, it's the same thing with dinosaurs. Take the Triceratops, for example, one of the famous dinosaurs, right? It's got the 3 horns, it's got the frill, it's on all fours, it's got like a parrot beak type thing.
Yep.
That's part of the ceratopsian classification. Well, there's the Protoceratops, there's the Styracosaurus, there's the Triceratops, but they all have the same basic look.
Features.
Frill, horns, beak, on all fours. That's the kind, so they're the ceratopsian kind. So how many kinds of ceratopsians needed to be on board is the same question as how many kinds of dogs needed to be on board. 2 of every 7 kind of creature, depending on clean, unclean, etc. And so if you think of the sharp-toothed dinosaurs, if you think of the long-necked dinosaurs, if you think of the ones with the plates on their back or the armored kind of ones, you probably have somewhere between 50 to 80 dinosaur kinds,
right?
Not thousands and thousands. Because let's face it, most scientists, when they find something, and everybody, as a scientist, you want to find something unique, you want to contribute to science, and you tend to want to name something after yourself. And so, maybe if I found a dinosaur, I'd be like, hey, it's a Callosaurus, or whatever, maybe a Natopteryx or something. But so we tend to think that, man, every week it seems on the news, hey, we found a new type of dinosaur. Oh, was it a long neck or a sharp tooth, or was it a spiky one? Oh, well, it was a long neck. Oh, okay. So, we tend to think there's all these, and I'm not trying to downplay it. Obviously, there are many different types of dinosaurs, but we're looking at about 50 to 80 kinds, and that's all included in the numbers that we crunched.
And so maybe because you've been doing this for so long, you seem to have a classification there that maybe might be helpful to just pull out that other people don't, is don't think of it as dinosaur kinds, because dinosaurs in and of themselves are not necessarily their own kind. Do you know what I mean? Right? That we're thinking of a category because the evolutionist story is that these things are all things that existed millions and millions of years ago. But there'd be a lot of similarities between, say, a crocodile, right, and some of these reptilian things that we would call dinosaurs, but we don't categorize crocodiles as dinosaurs.
Yes and no. So, for example, there would be similarities in, okay, it's reptilian, et cetera, like that. But dinosaurs were a unique type of creature in certain ways. For example, reptiles we see today have their legs out like this. Dinosaurs had their legs underneath them.
Interesting.
So structurally, and that's not just, well, that's our best guess. We've actually found like mummified dinosaurs now and very intact fossils. So we've got a good idea what these creatures looked like, how they moved, et cetera. And we're not disagreeing as creationists. We're like, yeah, that seems like good science. So they do seem to be unique. So, and the fact that they went extinct quicker than some other creatures, there could have been other distinctions that contributed to them going extinct before other creatures as well. For example, I've got a quote from an evolutionist saying that dinosaurs, you can tell whether a creature is warm-blooded or cold-blooded apparently by the matrix of the bones and the blood vessels and all this stuff. And this is a quote from an evolutionist saying that perhaps dinosaurs weren't cold-blooded and weren't warm-blooded, but some kind of in-between type of creature. Well, if that's true, perhaps that made them more vulnerable to climate variations, which God said after the flood, there was going to be heat and cold and stuff like that. So maybe that made them more vulnerable. Maybe that's why they perished quicker.
Yep.
So yes, in the sense that we give them all these Latin names, hey, there's a dog and there's an elephant and, a giraffe. And then we go, oh, and this is a Diplodocus and this is a Styracosaurus. And it sounds so different, right? But yeah, there were just a bunch of the creatures that God created. But yes, there were some distinctions of the dinosaur.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So the next question is, this may seem like a strange question. Did Noah also have a place for whales and fish? It says everything dies on the whole earth.
Right. Now, you've just gone through this, so you could probably answer this question quite well. Right?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the text itself actually says all things in which there was the breath of life. And so you mentioned it as well that, fish breathe differently, right? Insects breathe differently. And so what was preserved in the ark is all that had the breath of life, all those things that need fresh air in order to breathe rather than the things that were of aquatic life. So it might be, and there's you could play with this a lot because there's a lot of cool things when you think about discovering the oceans and what's in the oceans, that what was preserved in the ark is everything that needed the breath of life. And so underneath the waters, it's not that everything died, not all fish kinds died, all whale kinds died, but that underneath the waters, those that could survive that aquatic life survived,
right.
And everything that needed the ark to survive was in the ark. And so the text is actually very, very clear in saying that all things that in which there was the breath of life died on the face of the earth.
Right.
Everything that was not in the ark.
Correct. Yeah. Noah didn't need aquariums. Okay. There would have been a lot of sea creatures that did perish. We know that because we've got fossil evidence of them. You've got fossil, whole pools of whales that were buried rapidly. I mean, think about the size of a whale and you've got a fossil. How much sediment needed to come sliding into
very
place?
Quickly.
Right. It didn't sink to the bottom and get slowly covered, right? Like you commonly hear the evolutionist explanation. So yeah, you would have had turbidity currents. You would have had, seismic, problems, sediments, vast bunches of sediments, slamming onto the shores and burying things. But no, he didn't need to have aquatic creatures.
And the text for this is it's in Genesis chapter 7, verse 21 says, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarmed on the earth, and all mankind." Verse 22, "Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died."
Correct.
So that's that. It's very specific about what died, and
That's right.
It was everything in whose nostrils was the breath of life, all things that moved on the earth.
And the same representation is what went on the ark.
That's right.
Right. So
Yeah. And it is interesting when you think about that, because when you think about it, I think there is a question that gets us to this when it talks about the tectonic shift that likely happened, that you and I think happened during the time of the flood. There was a lot of cataclysmic, and that's actually the word that's used here for flood. It's the word cataclysmo, which was the only time in Scripture that this sort of event is referred to as this cataclysm. There was a lot going on under the surface that probably did end up killing a whole lot of aquatic life, as you said. But it's not. The text does not require that everything that was in the water died.
We
and that's
see
how we
this
know it
reflected in the fossil record in the fact that some of the fossils, at the Creation Museum, you can go and you can see a creature giving birth, and it's fossilized. I mean, how rapid did that thing get buried, right?
Seriously.
You've got fossils of fish eating another fish. I mean, he's literally gulping down his meal, and he got flash frozen. And some people would think, oh, well, maybe he choked on it and it floated down. That's not what happens.
Yeah.
That's not what happens. You have to bury the organism entirely and completely.
and quickly.
Yes. So fossils are the evidence of something happening quickly, not the evidence of something happening slowly.
Yeah.
So it is a cataclysm. It is the deluge. It is rapid burial, which the flood makes good sense of.
Yeah, absolutely. Number 6, your explanation of the theory that at the time of the Great Flood, all the continents were joined as one is something that is geologically well supported. Listening to you speak yesterday answered one of my questions, but I thought I would still send it in for those that perhaps missed that sermon. How did giant sloths and other slow-moving, non-swimming land animals get from distant continents to the Ark in the Middle East? Even during the 100 years that it took Noah to build, it would be very difficult. However, across a continuous landmass with God's help, entirely possible. So he kind of answered his own question there, but and kind of alluded to it. But let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I continually find, as a matter of fact, on Sunday, I had a question, and it again reiterates what's happening. I think here previous to you speaking and giving the answer. Somebody asked me about the Garden of Eden, and where I thought it was, and I'm like, it was destroyed in the flood, because everything that was on the earth at the time was destroyed in the flood. Right. A lot of people today are trying to say, well, yeah, we've got Australia and we've got Africa, and none of that was here before the flood.
That's right.
These are all, the continents that we now live on today after that. And so, the question in his mind was, well, how did the sloths come to, well, if there was one continent, that could have happened, right?
That's right.
So yeah, there was a long time for God to send the animals, and there was no separation of continents like we have today, we would believe, because Genesis says the waters were gathered to one area would mean there's one continent.
That's right. And so just for those who might have missed the sermon, so I can explain it for maybe some of your viewers, but I'm sure you've touched on this. So we would believe that when God created the world, because of how it's described, he created the land together. So one landmass covered by water. And what I think happened in the flood, and the text talks about the water that came up from below and from above.
The fountains of the great deep burst open. Yeah.
That's right. And so what I explained likely happened is one of the things that God did was start to break apart that one landmass, and water came up. A lot of people don't know this. I actually learned this from your video, that if you flattened out everything, all the Mount Everest and all the Mariana Trenches, and you brought them all together, that the earth would be covered by water by about 10,000 feet. I think you said it was Columbus, Christopher Columbus quote?
No, it was evolutionist Jacques Cousteau.
There you go.
He had that 70s, he'd explore the oceans and stuff, and he actually admitted that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
the water's still here.
And so when that one landmass was broken up in the deluge, whether that was how the flood originally happened, or if it happened underneath the waters during the cataclysm, who knows? But it seems as though the world that Noah went into the ark went with, and the one that he came out of the ark onto were very different. And actually, we get that language is actually corroborated by Peter, right? In his epistle, 2 Peter, he talks about the world that then was. And then he's talking about the world that then existed, meaning that he saw it as a completely different world. It was a completely different remade world. And so that continental world that we know of now was not what was there pre-flood.
Absolutely. Many times I'll have people say to me, yeah, but Cal, the world just looks old. And I'm like, no, it looks devastated.
That's
right?
Good.
Because they're looking at everything worn and scoured and all that stuff. Well, you think of the power of the deluge, of the flood. I mean, it was the most devastating event that's ever happened on the planet. So it left behind a much broken world than what was there before. It's very interesting because the concept that, one continent, people have done that. Hey, look, if you take these continents and stick them together, right?
They actually fit.
Do you know who thought of that first? Most people don't. It was actually a creationist.
Interesting.
Yeah, who proposed plate tectonics. It was a man named Antonio Snider Pellegrini. And he actually presented on this, and I think he even had a book. And anyway, he presented on it in Paris in 1859. Biblical creationist. And he'd seen that the continents seemed to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And he thought that the flood offered a credible mechanism powerful enough to move continents. So he first proposed that. Now, of course, at the time he was dismissed. Uniformitarianism, in geology was the watchword. Lyell's things, the concept of, old Earth and all that stuff was becoming popularized, and he was scoffed at. And lo and behold, today that's what evolutionists believe. So you hear the term Pangea. And so I'll have people say, well, do you believe in Pangea? And I'm like, well, it carries these evolutionary overtones, this baggage of continents separating over millions of years. But when you see where the plates come together today, and you see the mountain upthrusts, you see layers of sediment like this, and they're smashed together and like this, I'll say, well, think of your car in a parking lot. You're going 2 kilometers, I'm going 2 kilometers. Boom. Nothing happens. You smash them together, you're going to have, and that's what it looks like where the plates have met. It looks like that there was an event where, we're talking continental sprint, we'll call it, was happening. And so that seems to give good scientific explanation for the visible features we see on the planet today. And it was actually a creationist that came up with that idea.
Interesting. So, I had no idea. Yeah. That might actually be a good place to insert the question that you got in your small group yesterday, because it kind of talks about how animals migrated post-flood. So do you want to read that question?
Absolutely. Let's tackle that. So the question is, we know how the animals could have got to Noah because of one continent, but then after the flood, how did animals disperse to all the continents we see today? Okay, we're just 5 minutes away from the hour mark here, Nate, and I know we've got a lot of other questions, so why don't we just break here and we'll do a part 2, and that way people don't have to take too much of their time.
Sounds great to me.
Okay, looking forward to it.